yeah, you can read Plato's account of the trial, and at that, you know, he pretty narrowly is convicted. So they say that he is guilty. And then there's this bit where they say, okay, what's the penalty going to be? And the prosecution suggests death. And they say, well, what's your counter plea? And he could have given pretty much anything as a counter plea, like especially something that was more reasonable than what he suggested. And what he ends up suggesting is free meals for life, like an Olympic champion, which they did for Olympic champions. So, you know, and then eventually he says, okay, I'll pay a fine, but my friends will pay it for me because, you know, I don't have the money. So obviously the jurors weren't going to go along with that. So that's probably why he gets condemned to death. And yeah, I think that's meant to be the prison. So he gets condemned to death, and they send him to the prison. And you know, in the ancient world, or at least in ancient Athens, they didn't really imprison you for any length of time. It was really just a place where you sat while you were waiting to be executed. And in Socrates' case, it so happened that around the time that he was meant to be executed, there was a sacred mission to Delos. The Athenians sent a ship from up near Marathon, I believe, within the Athenian territory. And it went to the sacred island of Delos, and it came back. And during that time, because it was sort of a holy period, yeah, Athens had lots of religious festivals, and so did many other Greek city-states, but during that time you weren't meant to execute people because, yeah, according to Greek religion, executions and killings and things have this sort of miasma to them, or at least, you know, they're not something you want to do during a religious festival. So they put Socrates in prison, and you can read accounts. You can read again Plato's dialogues that have to do with the last days of Socrates. So these are often collected together, and in fact they were copied together in the medieval period. The manuscripts were copied together. So these dialogues are the Apology, which isn't really a dialogue, it's just a speech. The speech that Socrates is meant to have given during his trial. Then there is the Phaedo, which is arguments for immortality, essentially. So Socrates and some of his closest companions are in prison, and they're saying, "Oh, it's so sad, you're going to die." And he says, "Well, he's the perfect philosopher." He says, "No, I'm actually kind of chill about it because I've rationally convinced myself that my soul is immortal." And he has a few arguments, and then at the end of the Phaedo, he drinks a little cup of hemlock, and his last words he says to his friend Crito are, give a cock to Asclepius. So sacrifice a cock to Asclepius, the god of healing. And there's also the Crito. So having mentioned Crito, there's also a dialogue, even shorter dialogue, Crito, where he's again in prison, and he's talking to Crito, and again it's the story of, you know, Crito's more upset than Socrates, and he says to Socrates, "Well, look, you know, we can bust you out of this prison. You can just flee and, you know, go somewhere else, and it's all going to be fine." And Socrates says, "No, I'm not going to do it because I want to be obedient to the laws of Athens." And he actually has a kind of conversation, a dialogue within a dialogue with the laws. He personifies the laws of Athens. And it's an interesting dialogue, partly because it seems to have a very early version of the social contract theory. Socrates basically says, "Well, I've grown up in Athens, I've profited from Athenian security and culture and all these things, and I've been educated in Athens, and therefore I've sort of implicitly given my obedience to the laws, and so it would be a bad thing to do to disobey them now." And as we know, Socrates thinks that, you know, one of the worst things you can do, one of the worst things that can happen to you in your life is to knowingly do evil. So yeah, he passes on Crito's offer to bust him out of prison. And so yeah, and sorry, the Euthyphro is the final one, which is about the last days of Socrates. That one actually is set in the prison. That's set just before the trial, and it's set way over there where we started the series at the Royal Stoa, which they haven't actually reconstructed in this game, but I talked a bit about it. And that one, he just meets a guy, Euthyphro, and he has a very classic sort of early Plato period conversation about what piety is. Anyway, so there is a building which, you know, used to be pretty confidently identified as the prison, and I'll put a link to a drawing of it, how they would have reconstructed this building. So in real life, there was a building here-ish, I suppose. I mean, it's actually sort of more to the west, I think. It's more that way. And so I dug in the Agra in 2011, and then I was lucky enough to be able to go back in 2016, and I was just sort of helping out. I wasn't doing much, but they reopened a trench around here, or around wherever the actual supposed prison is. And that was super interesting because they were saying, Laura Galinsky, who was the trench supervisor, and also, you know, historian of Athens and an epigraphist, a specialist in inscriptions, she was saying that the opinions within the people who dig in the Agra have changed on this building. Yeah, it used to be confidently identified as a prison, and the reason is because the actual building doesn't quite look like this. It's sort of two rows of rooms around a courtyard. So there is sort of a courtyard, and then this is kind of accurate. There's a building in the corner with I think 4 rooms, and they kind of reconstructed a bit like this. So this is kind of is still pretty good reconstruction. And the idea is, as here actually, that this would have been a guard tower, and so in there you would have had. Let's just look at this view. Say there would have been these 2 rows of rooms, and Socrates would have been there in a cell. And you know, I think in the 70s, archaeologists were going to the press and saying, "Look, we found the prison of Socrates. We've also found little jars, little clay pots." And the theory there was, well, these very jars could have held hemlock for executions, and you know, one of them may have been the very jar of hemlock that Socrates drank. And they also found a bust of Socrates. And you know, you can read in the reports, you know, is this a coincidence? Maybe not. But then again, maybe it was. Maybe it is a coincidence. And actually, I think that the reason that the archaeologists who work here, work in the Agra, are cooling on this theory a little bit is just because, you know, I think over time people have started to cool down a bit and think, well, actually, you know, we have this human tendency to want to identify a building that we've dug up as something we've read about. So this is definitely also to do with Socrates. It's just that prison, and yeah, and maybe, but maybe not. And you always have to think of, if you want to be really critical about your own theories, which is a good practice, you've always got to think of, you know, well, what else could explain those things? And of course, I don't think they've actually found any traces of hemlock in these jars. So these little ceramic pots really could have just held anything. And this kind of building, this shape of building with rooms down the side of a central courtyard, it's very consistent also, as the archaeologists have always acknowledged, with just sort of any kind of industrial, or sort of, well, not industrial, but like, you know, commercial or workshop or anything like that. It could very easily have been something like that, and it's close to the Agra, so and yeah, the bust of Socrates, I mean, who knows? It's later, and we know Athens was a huge educational center in the Hellenistic period, and there were plenty of philosophers around. People went there because it was seen as a center of culture, partly because of its distinguished past. And so the idea that you would have a bust of Socrates in this area and it would get found here, I mean, it's not very implausible at all. It could have just been anything. Could have just been a random statue of Socrates. So yeah, it's interesting. If you look in the drawings, I think John Travelos, who was, you know, really great contributor to the study of where things were in ancient Athens, he just does a drawing where this is like a prison tower, and these are the cells, but you know, you always got to remember these guys are reconstructing. Archaeology is usually involves a lot of interpretation as well. So I don't know if the real building was a prison or not, but yeah, still being debated. So yeah, so that is the prison, and that over there you can still see are supposed to have been the courts. And thank you for the help from the bird. I've forgotten the bird's name. Sorry. I obviously haven't been playing this very much. Okay, so I'll stop there, and we can end with a beautiful view of, I believe, yeah, I believe this is the Areopagus. And next time, which also has a court, a murder court. Next time we're gonna do the Areopagus. So I'll see you then.